So, good afternoon. My name's Amanda, and this session is going to be on macros, specifically within Excel. So, over the series of webinars that we've run on Excel, we've seen that Microsoft Excel has quite a lot of functionality built into it. We've been able to access things in the formulas library. We've been able to use data validation to try and minimize human error. But there gets a point where you need something a bit more, and that's where macros come in. So one of the main reasons for using macros is to try to stop all of the repetitive things that you do with Excel on a regular basis. Now, before we go any further, I'm going to explain a little bit about what macros are and why you need to be careful of them. So macros are a way of repeating actions that we do regularly. So things like deleting columns or rows, sorting and filtering, and adding formulas. We can get Excel to do what we want it to do on a regular basis. And we can do that at a click of a button. What macros do is in the background, they write the code that tells it what instructions to carry out. And that's where we have the first warning. Macros write code. So macros are basically code. So unless you know what a macro does, you should never run a macro. If you open a workbook and it asks you whether you want to enable macros, unless you know what those macros are going to do, you should never enable macros. And we'll talk about how you can set up enabling macros and that sort of thing in a minute. Because as well as doing things in Excel, a macro is written in a language called VBA, Visual Basic for Applications. And it's available in the Office applications, so you can use it in Word and PowerPoint and Outlook. But it can also control your computer. So it can go and look in folders, it can open files, it can delete things, it can add passwords to things. And it can do that without you having any ability to stop it once you started it. That's why macros are often disabled in companies, but they do still have a place. So if you have any repetitive jobs and you want to have it done quickly and simply, macros are a great tool. To see your macro settings and to access macros, the easiest thing is to have the developer ribbon on. So it's not on by default. So if you can't see a developer ribbon, you will need to go to your File and Options. And then in Options, if you go to Customize Ribbon, you should see an option there for Developer. Stick a tick in there, click OK, and you should then see the developer ribbon appear. You can access macros from the View ribbon. So if I click on View, you'll see at the very end there, we've got a little macros button. And if I go to that, click on the drop down, you'll see I've got View Macros, Record Macro, and something that says Use Relative References. However, on the developer ribbon, it also gives me a button for macro security. If I click on that, it takes me into the Trust Center. And these are my macro settings. So disabling macros without notification means that no macros will run and it won't tell you that there are even macros there. You can have it to disable macros with a notification, so it'll still disable them and not allow you to run them, but it will tell you that it's done that. You can have digitally signed macros, or the one that you're most likely to need to use if you've recorded macros is enable macros. And again, there is a warning there, not recommended. Potentially dangerous code can run. So if you have that enabled, you have to be really careful that you know what the macros are going to do and you know that they're safe for you to use. So there ends my lesson on warnings about macros. So let's get into what a macro can do for you in a positive way. I'm sure that we all get reports dropped into our emails or spat out of databases, and every time we have to go and clean them up. One of the biggest problems with databases is that the data you get out often needs a lot of work doing to it before you can start using it in Excel for analysis or anything else. So this is the orders that I have been using in some of the previous sessions. So we've got a customer, an employee, an order ID, when it was ordered, when it was wanted, when we shipped it, who the courier was, how much that cost, and where it was going. Now, for this session, I'm going to say that I don't care about the employee. I don't care about the courier or the freight cost, or particularly the ship country. So those are columns I'm going to get rid of, because what I'm interested in is any orders that were late based on the required date. So to do that, the first thing I would have to do is get rid of the columns I don't want and add a new column to check to see whether we shipped it on or before the required date. So that's something I would have to do to this report every time it came in. Time consuming and not quick and easy. So I'm going to record a macro. So when I say record a macro, it's a little bit like those of you who are old enough to remember the old video recorders. You would record something and then you could go back and watch it over and over again. And that's what a macro is. So once I start recording my macro, it's going to list everything I do. And then when I've finished, I can go back and run that macro again, and it will do everything that I did in the same order with the same outcome. There are a couple of things that we need to think about when we start recording a macro. So if I go to record macro, you'll see first thing it wants is a macro name. When you look at your macros, the name is the only hint you get as to what that macro does. So I'm going to give this a sensible name. Just admit. So macro names cannot have spaces in. You can use underscore, or the most common option is to use capital letters for each new word. So I'm going to call this clean up orders. Sensible name tells me what it does, so I can immediately identify when I look at the macro list what this macro is going to do. And I can add a description. So it's going to remove unwanted columns and add formula for late deliveries. There is another thing that we need to pay attention to. Store macro in. And I've got three options. I can save it in this workbook, I can save it in a new workbook, or I can save it in a personal macro workbook. I'll go into more detail about what those are in a minute, but I'm going to leave it at this point in time in this workbook. Click OK and it starts recording. Down here on my status bar, I can see my macro recording. So if you want to make sure that you've got the macro on your status bar, right click on the status bar and make sure there is a tick against macros. Because this is recording, everything I do now, scrolling, changing worksheets, anything, will be recorded and therefore repeated when I run it again. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to carefully select the columns I want to get rid of. So column B, I don't want. Select it and delete. I don't want the courier or the freight or the ship country. Right click and delete. I then want to add a formula in column F now, which is going to tell me whether this is late. So I'm going to put a heading of late, question mark. So now I'm going to type in the formula that I want to use. So if, so the first thing is if we haven't shipped it yet, so if the ship date is empty, then I'm going to leave it empty. If not, if the ship date is greater than the required date, then it was late. So comma, yes. And if not, I'm going to leave it empty and close off my two if functions. So if you want a reminder on the if, we do have the session that we recorded on the if function. So that's my formula. Press enter. Clearly I've done it wrong. I've put full stops in instead of commas. There we go. Helps if I hit the right key. Having entered the first formula, click back on it, and I'm going to use the fill handle and double click to copy it down. So I can see that there are some orders that were late being shipped. I'm not going to scroll down because if I do, it will record me scrolling and it'll repeat that when I get round to running this again. So now what I want to do is get rid of anything that wasn't late. So I'm going to click on my heading, and on the home ribbon, I'm going to turn on my filtering and click filter. And then I'm going to filter anything that hasn't got a yes in it because they're the ones I'm going to delete, and click OK. Now I'm going to select everything that hasn't got a yes in it. So all of my results, I'm going to select them all. So I'm going to select the top row first, Control Shift and the down arrow. And then I'm going to delete the sheet rows. And the last thing I'm going to do is clear the filter and then go back up to the top. So Control and up arrow and then down once will show me my results. So I have now done everything that I need to do to get just a list of the late deliveries. At this point, I'm going to stop my macro recording. So I can do it from here or go back to developer and click stop macro. And that's it. My macro is now recorded. I'm going to undo everything that I did. So we're back to where we started from, as though I just opened this from scratch. And now I'm going to test the macro I've just recorded. So remember, I can either get to it on view or on developer, and I want to see my macros. So view macros and all open workbooks. I'm looking for any macros. I've only got one. So I select the macro that I want to run. Remember, I said the only clue you get is the macro name, which is why you need to carefully name your macros. And then I'm going to click run. And there we go. It's just repeated everything that I did in a split second, a lot quicker than I did. And that's now ready for me to send off to whoever wanted to know what late deliveries we had. Here comes the second warning. I'm going to undo it, except I can't. When you run a macro, you cannot undo what the macro has done because it's in code. It's not an action that you took. So having done that, the only option I would have now to go back to my workbook without having all of those rows deleted and the columns removed is to close this without saving it and reopen it. So running macros, you need to be very careful that you are running the macro in the right place and it's the right macro, because if not, you will need to close the workbook and you will lose everything that you've done that you hadn't saved. So my second tip is, before you run a macro, make sure you've saved your workbook. There is another problem with this. So this is a report that came out of our database. I get it every Monday morning maybe, and I do this analysis on it. I clean it up and send it off to someone else. Next week, when I get the orders worksheet in, it's going to be a different workbook. And when I clicked record macro, I stored it in this workbook, which means that a new workbook with the same sort of data in will not have this macro in it. So I need to think very carefully about how I'm going to use the macro that I've recorded. To save a workbook with the macro in it, I would need to go to File, Save As, and then I need to change the type of macro that I'm saving. The type of workbook. Workbooks that are XLSX cannot have macros in. So it would remove all of the macros from your workbook. There are 3 types of workbook that are specifically designed for macros. The obvious ones, so we've got a macro-enabled workbook, which is a .xlsm, so M at the end instead of X. There is a macro-enabled template, so like a standard Excel template, which is XLTX, but with M at the end. There is also a binary workbook. So Excel binary workbooks will allow you to save macros in them. Just save it as my file. So that's now saved the macro that's stored in this workbook that I can then run again. But if I go and run that macro again now, it's added another column called late. It's removed things I didn't want it to remove, and I've got a bit of a mess now. So I'm going to close that without saving it. And I'm going to open the original orders worksheet that I had. So this is before I saved any macros or anything else into it. So when I recorded my macro, what I needed to do was store it somewhere else. So order, cleaning, and the option that I need to select is personal macro workbook. So a personal macro workbook is a workbook that's hidden inside your copy of Excel. It is exclusive to you. So I'm going to record this macro that's going to do the same thing as before, but this time it's going to be stored in Excel, which means I can use it on any workbook that I open. So if I click OK now, same thing, I'm going to delete that. I'm going to delete these. I'm going to add something called late. If there's no ship date, leave it blank. Otherwise, if the ship date is greater than the required date, then say late. If not, leave it empty and close off my functions. Copy it back down. Add my filter. Filter to just the blanks. Delete any blank rows. Back up to the top. Take the filter off. And there's my macro finished. I'm going to close this like I did before, and I'm not going to save it. Now it asks me, do I want to save the changes in my personal macro workbook? So everything that I just recorded is now saved in that hidden workbook, and I want to save that because I want to keep the macro so I can use it again. Now I'm going to open orders up again, so maybe this is next Monday morning. I get my new worksheet in, and now I can run that macro because it's stored in my copy of Excel. So when I go to view and macros and view macros, you'll see it says personal.xlsb. That's stored in my personal macro workbook. And there is the macro that I recorded. I can run that and it will do everything I want it to on any workbook that I've opened. And there's the key thing. If I open a different workbook and run the macro, it will still delete columns B, F, G, and H, or whatever it was. It will still add the new late, filtering, deleting the rows, and then unfiltering. It doesn't care what the data is. It is a series of steps that you've asked it to do, and it will just repeat them. There is no, are you sure you want to do this on this workbook? This is what this macro will do. I have made the mistake before of accidentally running a macro that deleted a lot of things on the wrong worksheet or on the wrong workbook. You only do it a couple of times before you stop and think about what you're doing with macros, because once you've done them, the only way to undo them is to close it without saving, and you will lose anything you hadn't saved to that point. Having said that, you can see how quickly that filtered out the late entries. I didn't need to know how to enter the formula. I didn't need to delete all of the columns or filter it or delete it. It's just ready now for me to send on. So that's an introduction to recording a macro. Before we go any further, on the developer ribbon, there is an option to see Visual Basic. And if I click that, it takes me into this separate screen. Now, it might look very scary, But basically what I'm looking for is for the macro that I recorded. So that VBA project is my orders workbook. I didn't save it in there. I saved it in my personal macro workbook, which is here. Under modules, I will find module 1. And if I open that up, here is the macro that I recorded. And you can see the steps that it's recorded. So it's selected columns, it's deleted them, more columns, and deleted them. And that's what a macro is, a series of instructions for it to do various things that you can then repeat. The problem with recording a macro in your personal macro workbook is if you have annual leave and somebody else is responsible for doing all of this, they do not have that macro in their copy of Excel. So you would need to either save the macro in a separate workbook that you can send with it, or you would need to send them a copy of the macro that you've got. So you could do that by going into your Visual Basic, going into the module, and everything starts and ends with sub. So everything between the sub and the name of the macro to the end sub would need to be copied. You can right click and copy. I can put that in Notebook or just in an email. They can then copy it, open their personal macro workbook, go into the module, click at the end of the last macro they've got, or at the top if it's blank, and then paste it. They will then have it saved in their personal macro workbook, and they'll be able to use that macro as well. So that's using orders. And to look at something slightly different now. So you may have seen this before on one of the previous sessions. This is my invoicing system. So I've played around a little bit with this and added some of the skills that we've used in previous weeks. So I've got now an invoice where I can select a product code, enter a quantity, it will calculate the price, and I've got my total price at the bottom. I need to fill out the customer name and address. I need to change the invoice number when I've finished, and I need to get rid of everything that's on here. But so that we've got a record, I've got an orders page, which I want to store the invoice, the sale amount, the VAT delivery, and order date, etc. I've got a products page, which is going to keep track of my stock levels. So if on my invoice I tried to order 25 of something, it'll come up with some conditional formatting and coding that says there's not enough stock. This is what we've got. So I can then amend this accordingly. 15 is fine. I want this to work at the click of a button. So I'm going to think carefully about what it is I want people to do. I want them to enter a product code and a quantity. When they've finished, I want to transfer those details onto my orders page. When they transfer to the orders page, it needs to go on a new row. So it's no good me recording a macro, copying the invoice number, going to orders and pasting it in A2. Because as we saw from the instruction list, that will constantly go to A2, because that's what I've clicked on, and it will paste it in there. So what I want to use is the relative referencing. So if you remember, we've got the option to use relative references. So I'm going to fill in a couple of things on here. Let's have some pads. Let's have 10 of those. And that's going to be my order. What I want it to do is I want it to transfer the information from here onto the orders page. So the first thing I want to take is the invoice number. So I'm going to start recording my macro. I'm going to call it submit invoice. I'm going to store it in this workbook because it's only going to be relevant to using this workbook. Doesn't matter who opens it, they want to be able to use these macros in this workbook. And I'm going to click OK. So the first thing I want to do is I want to go to where my invoice number is and copy it. My invoice number is always going to be in the same place. So I'm going to click there and I'm going to use Control C to copy it. Then I want to go to my orders page. Now at this point, I want to make sure that it's not always going in A2. So I'm going to turn on relative references, which means that whatever movement I make from the initial place is what's going to happen when I run the macro again. So I'm going to paste it in here and ignore that and click OK. And then I'm going to click one cell to the right. I'm going to change my pasting to just pasting values. And now I'm going to turn off relative referencing, because when I go back to my invoice page to get the sale amount, it's going to be in the same place every time. So sale amount is going to be my total. I'm going to copy it, go back to my products page, sorry, not products, orders, and then I'm going to paste it. And now it's got a reference error because when I paste it, I need to paste it as just the, ignore that, just the value. So paste special and values. And then I'm going to turn on my relative referencing and move to the next cell where I'm going to get the VAT. So turn relative references back off, back to the invoice, grab the VAT, copy it, back to my orders, paste as values, back to my relative referencing, move across one cell. So now I want the delivery charge, turn off relative referencing, back to invoice, copy the delivery charge, back to orders, turn on relative referencing, paste this as a value, move to the next cell, turn it back off, and get my invoice date. So my invoice date is going to be this one here. I'm going to copy it, back to orders, turn on relative referencing, paste in the value, and move to the next one. So the next one is delivery date. That's calculated automatically as 7 days after the order date. Invoice due date is also automatically calculated. Next one along is customer name. So now I can turn off relative referencing, go back to my invoice, copy where the customer name will be stored, back to orders, turn on relative referencing, paste special as values, and then go to the next cell along, turn off relative referencing, back to my invoices, copy, back to my orders, paste values, and then I'm at the end of this line. So before I go and stop my macro recording or do anything else, I want to turn on relative referencing and go to the next line down. Then it's all set up and ready for me to do the next invoice. So I'm going to stop that now and go back to invoices. I'm going to remove these. I'm going to put something different in. So product code, let's have 11 and 12, and I'll have 8 of each of these. So now I'm going to run my macro. Okay, submit invoice and run it. Now, hopefully, yeah, there we go. So I've now got my invoice in here. If I run it again, so if I go to macros, submit invoice and run, it should put it on the next row down. So I've now got, okay, it didn't seem to record me moving to the next row. Let's see if it works a third time. that's better, but it seems to have missed recording me moving to the next row down, and I've put in a product number rather than the invoice number, but I can always fix that later by going directly into the macro. So the next thing I want to clear all of this information out, and I want to update the invoice number. So first thing I'm going to do is get rid of the product code. Now, one of the things that I want to make sure doesn't happen is when I click on here, I can see the formula and I can delete it. So by default, all cells in an Excel worksheet, if I right click and go to my format cells, on the protection, they're all set to locked and not hidden. So this protection for cells works when you protect the worksheet. And what I want to do is I want to unlock the areas that I want people to be able to enter things into, and everything else can stay locked. So the first thing that I'm going to do is select the entire workbook, right click and go to my format cells. I'm going to set everything to be locked and hidden. So you won't be able to enter anything, and if you click on it, you won't see anything in the cell. So that's the whole worksheet locked and hidden. Now I'm going to unlock what I want people to be able to use. So this range of cells here, if I go to my format cells, I'm going to unlock them and unhide them. Same thing with this section here, format cells, unlock, unhide. And the same with these two cells here. Not locked, not hidden. When I protect my worksheet, that will stop people from accidentally trying to delete something they shouldn't be deleting, because my macro is going to be doing the deleting for me. So they shouldn't need to do anything to mess up your spreadsheet. So I'm going to set that protection now. If I go to review, protect sheet. So I'm not going to bother with a password, but you can password protect it. But I'm going to allow people to select locked cells, even though they won't be able to do anything with it. Select unlocked cells. That one has to be ticked, otherwise they won't be able to click on anything. So I'm going to say OK to that. Now I can click on this, but I can't make changes to it. I can click on this and I can make changes to it. And anything that's got a formula, when I select it, I can't see it in the formula bar. So if somebody's trying to work out how I calculate my discount, they can't see the calculation up here. Now I'm going to record another macro, which is going to be called clear invoice in this workbook. And all this is going to do is it's going to get rid of what's in here. So select it and delete it. And what's in here, select and delete. And what's in the customer name and address. Stop the macro from running. And now I've got a macro that I can run that will clear anything that we've put in here. So if I start adding things, and then I go to my macros, and I use the clear invoice one and run it, it'll clear that out, ready for me to use again. The next thing I want to do is increase the invoice number by 1. Now remember, all we're doing is repeating an action. So I've got a little cheat to increase that number by 1 each time. Up here, I'm going to put a number 1 in the cell, or at least I will do when I've unprotected it. So let's unprotect my worksheet, stick a number 1 in there, and then I can protect it again. Because the macro that's going to increase the invoice number is always just going to copy and paste, but I'm going to use paste special. So when I record my macro, and this is now macro 3, I'm going to leave it as macro 3 because I'm going to combine them all in a minute. All it's going to do is select that cell and copy it, select the invoice number cell, and then paste special. And what I want to use is the value and add. OK. It doesn't like the merge cell. Okay. So let's stop that. I'll get rid of that macro later. Because this has got a merge cell of 2 rows, I need to merge that as well. So back to unprotecting the sheet and merge the cell. Let's put it up at the top so it's not visible when I've finished. So we'll try that again. Called a macro, it's now going to be macro 4. Select the cell and copy. Select the invoice number, paste special, values, and add. And that's all I'm going to do with that. And then I'm going to click back on the product code, ready to start again. So if I now run macro 4 again, what I should see is every time I run it, it increases the invoice number by 1 because it's just copying and pasting to add it on. So I've got 3 different macros. I've got the one that copies to the orders worksheet. I've got the one that increases the invoice number and the one that deletes the product code and quantity. And I want all of those macros to work when I run one macro because they're all the same thing. So I'm going to go to Developer and into my Visual Basic. On the left-hand side, I'm looking for modules, and I've got module 1 with my submit invoice. So this was the macro that was recorded to submit the invoice to the orders page. Just going to look at why that's not working. Under that, you'll see I've got a line and then I've got my clear invoice macro. So that's the start of the second macro that I recorded. I'm going to take off the end sub because that says we've finished running the macro, and take off the thing that says clear invoices because that's the start of it. I can leave the clear invoice macro description, and I'm just going to combine those 2 macros together. Now I said I was going to get rid of macro 3, so I'm just going to get rid of that, everything from macro 3 to end sub. So this is the end of the clear invoice macro, and that's the start of macro 4 where I increase the invoice number. And I'm going to join those together by getting rid of the end sub and getting rid of the start of the next one. So now I've got one end sub at the end, one sub routine at the start, and this is all one macro now called submit invoice. So now when I go to my macros, my submit invoice does all 3 bits of code or actions in one. So I could submit the invoice and it would run through and do all of those different things. And then I can see it's put my invoices in, and I've got my invoice here with my new order number. The last thing I want, and I demonstrated perfectly why it's not a good idea, is to expect people to go to view macros, find the right macro and run the right one. As I say, I beautifully demonstrated why that's not a good idea. So what I'd like is a little button that I can press that will run that macro. So on my insert, I'm going to pick a shape and I'm going to draw a button. I'm going to put it over the number 1 just to hide the number 1. And let's see if we can make it a nicer color. Let's use that one close enough. And I'm going to type submit invoice so it's got some text on it. And I can make it look pretty, center it, make it a bit bigger, make it bold. Not quite that big. So that's my button, but at the moment it's a shape with some text on it. If I right click, I can assign a macro to a shape. The macro I want to assign is submit invoice. So I'm going to select that and click OK. When I click off it, now when I hover over it, you'll see I get a little pointy finger. So If I click on that now, it will run that macro. So I'm now on invoice number 5. It's cleared out anything that was in there before and transferred everything across to here, which isn't working properly. I'm not very good at recording macros with relative references, as I have also demonstrated. I tend to write directly in my macros. But that now does mostly what I want it to do. I would need to go and re-record the order transfer because it's not working the way it should. What I've also got in here is I've got my products and I've got a list of stock. So any stock that is not at 20 is ready for me to reorder. If I increase the stock level, I want 30 in stock each time. I've got that down here and it will set up an order for that. What we've seen in this session is macros that you can record yourself. So it's a show and tell to Excel to show Excel what you want it to do and how you want it to do it. That has limitations, but VBA doesn't. So macros and recording macros are an introduction to VBA, but it can do far more. So for example, I've got this list of orders that I want to make for the different items. Over here, I've got my supplier's email address. I can also put in a CC email address and a button here that says order stock. If I click order stock, what it's going to do is it's going to send an email. It's going to copy my order from my spreadsheet and put it into an email. And I should see that arrive in my inbox if I open Outlook up. So I will wait and hope that that arrives shortly. Just want to check that I did have it to send an email, not just display it. Yeah, it was set up to send, so it should send an email. But just in case it doesn't, I will set it up again and test it. It's also copied the quantity that was on order to my on order, which means that it's now telling me that I've got stock available to order. So if I have a look at restock and I go to A5 pads, currently my A5 pads, I've got 14 in stock, but I've got 16 on order. So if I try to choose A5 pads, so A4, next one down, and I wanted 18 or 19 of them, it will say there's only 14 available in stock, but 16 on order. So if I go to restock, once we get the stock in, I can click stock received and it will copy it across to my product's stock level. So once we've got the stock in, I've now got it to update that stock level and they're now ready. If I go to restock, we don't need any more. So unless I increase the quantity again, so now I want 10 of everything, I can click order stock, hoping now I've got Outlook open, it will actually send my email for me. Copied it across. There's my email coming in, hopefully. There we go, and there's the previous one. So it's copied my order, all of the items, the quantity required, sent it to the email address that I've given it, and it can do a lot more than that. To give you an idea of what is possible, if I show you some research data, and this could be any kind of data. So in here, this is some market research that was done by a company. There's a lot of it. So if I just give you a quick overview. So there are thousands and thousands of rows with different percentages for how people viewed different drinks. So that's my data. I think there's over 500,000 rows of data in there. And I've got a slide deck set up. So this is a PowerPoint template. This is just a small section of about 300 slides that are used, with lots of different charts in, areas for us to add information. If I was doing that manually for all of that data, it would take forever. But what you can do is you can get Excel to do all of that for you. So it will take all of the data, it will do all of your analysis, and then at the end of it all, it will spit you out a nice little report with all of the charts in. So this one has got heat maps. So we've got the data in there, and if you remember with conditional formatting, we can change the colours of cells based on their value. So this is effectively a nice heat map. We've got bubble charts. We've got pie charts with a separate chart in it. We've got our spider charts. We can add text. We can add pie charts. We can sort and filter, and we can even add icons that represent top values. And all of that can be done automatically. So this was a project for a drinks company, and one report was taking about 2 weeks to produce. With macros and VBA code, that was reduced to doing, I think, something like 15 countries in less than a day. So macros are definitely something that you need to start looking into if you find that you are doing the same thing over and over again and it's taking you a long time. Just easy things like having a report where you can delete columns and add some formulas and add some filters. That can save you 10 or 15 minutes every time you have to do it. And if you add that up over a year, you can start seeing the time-saving things. The other thing that it can do is help reduce human error. There is nothing worse than you spending ages putting all of these formulas in and then someone going, right, I've done with that, selecting it and just hitting delete. All your formulas have gone, any conditional formatting can be removed, and you're back to having a spreadsheet that's broken and doesn't work properly. So using macros to do that cleanup process, using the security options to stop people from being able to accidentally enter something into a cell with formulas is really useful and definitely well worth doing if you spent a long time setting something up. And if you're interested in learning more about VBA, then do let us know. We can run you courses on learning how to actually write the code behind it, because it's there where you can really find the benefits. So doing things like sending an email and copying data to temporary worksheets so that you can attach it to files. I've done things like setting up certificates. So when people attend courses, they like to have something to say that they've been on a course. And then you get their email addresses and your templates for the certificates, and you merge the two. But you can do that with a macro. All you need is the template and the list of email addresses, and you can get it to do it all for you. Every time you run a course, you just click a button and it produces the certificates for you. If you've got any questions about macros or anything we've covered in this session, do feel free to hang about. I will stay on the call for a few more minutes until the end of the session. If not, thank you for your time. Hopefully you found it useful, and I'll get Rebecca to send across the feedback forms and the handouts and guides for this and the link to the video once she's back, hopefully next week. Thanks for your time.